A few years ago, during an important meeting, something curious happened. Two people were debating a proposal in front of a room full of executives. One of them spoke quickly, stacking arguments as if trying to win an invisible race. The other, barely spoke. He simply observed. Sometimes he slightly tilted his head. Sometimes he made a short note. Nothing dramatic. And yet, something strange was happening in the room. As the conversation progressed, the eyes in the room began to silently drift toward the person who remained calm. It wasn't the volume of the voice that dominated the space. It was something else. A kind of psychological control that was almost imperceptible. And this is where something that sparks intellectual curiosity begins. Because what few people realize is that real power in a conversation rarely belongs to the person who speaks the most. Now think about this for a second. Most people enter discussions trying to prove their intelligence, defend their position, show that they are right. It's almost automatic. But there is a strategy used by great strategists that goes in the opposite direction. They don't try to win the conversation immediately. First, they observe the game unfolding. It's like watching a chess match before making the first move. An old mentor once said something curious. Whoever reacts too quickly usually reveals more than they should. In other words, while some try to impress, others are quietly trying to think ahead. And this small mental habit creates a huge competitive advantage in any social environment. And here's the fascinating part. This ability isn't something only a few special people are born with. It can be deliberately developed, almost like a mental workout. In other words, anyone can train their mind to notice details that most people miss. Simple things. Someone's tone of voice, the way someone avoids answering a direct question, the moment when the energy of an entire room suddenly shifts. These signals may seem small, but together they reveal powerful patterns. That's where the real game of social intelligence begins. And as this perception starts to develop, an inevitable question arises in the mind of the observer. If silence already reveals so much power, imagine what happens when someone learns to use this perception strategically. But before we get there, it's necessary to understand something fundamental about how the most strategic minds think. There is a curious idea about intelligence that almost everyone accepts without questioning it. Many people believe that having a sharp mind means thinking fast, responding immediately, always having an opinion ready. In meetings, debates, or difficult conversations, it seems that whoever reacts first demonstrates more confidence. But what few people realize is that this logic often works against them. The great strategists of history, leaders, negotiators, political advisors, were rarely the fastest to speak. They were the most careful observers, because when someone slows down their thinking, something interesting happens. The mind begins to see layers that previously went unnoticed. And this awakens a powerful intellectual curiosity, almost as if the social world were a puzzle full of hidden clues. An old strategy professor used to say something that sounded simple, but carried enormous weight. Most people try to think faster. Strategists learn to think better. And thinking better involves 3 silent abilities. First, observation, noticing what is happening beyond the words. Then, social reading, understanding intentions, motivations, and emotions that are rarely spoken aloud. And finally, something that completely changes any social dynamic, emotional control. When someone remains calm while others become agitated, an invisible form of social power begins to emerge. It isn't noise, it isn't force, it's psychological control. And interestingly, this has been a strategy used by great strategists for centuries. Now imagine applying this in everyday situations. A job negotiation, a family discussion, a team debate. The average person reacts to what is happening in the moment. But someone who learns to think ahead begins to notice patterns before others even realize what is happening. It's like watching a movie while already knowing what the next scene will be. This perception creates a huge competitive advantage in any social environment. And the good news is that this does not depend on special talent or being born with an extraordinary mind. It is about mental discipline, observing more, reacting less, and training your mind to understand people the same way a strategist studies a map before entering a battle. And this is exactly where the first practical step of this journey appears. Something simple, yet surprisingly powerful. Some time ago, a young professional started working at a very competitive company. During the first few months, he barely spoke in meetings. While others constantly tried to show their intelligence, he remained observing. Not because he was shy, but because he was trying to understand the game. Who really made the decisions? Who was seeking recognition? Who disagreed, but said nothing? As the weeks passed, something curious began to happen. When he finally spoke, his observations seemed extremely precise. People listened carefully, and this sparked a great intellectual curiosity among those in the room. How could he notice details that no one else mentioned? What few people realize is that he was using a strategy used by great strategists for centuries. Observe first, act later. A good way to understand this is to imagine the work of a detective. In movies, the detective doesn't solve the case by running around the city all the time. He observes small clues, a strange gesture, a contradiction, an unexpected pause in someone's speech. In the social world, the exact same thing happens. Those who talk constantly lose the opportunity to see these clues. But those who learn to slow down begin to notice patterns. Whoever interrupts all the time wants to dominate the conversation. Whoever avoids certain questions is usually hiding something. Whoever tries too hard to prove intelligence is often seeking approval. And when someone begins to see these dynamics, a silent form of psychological control emerges. It isn't aggressive manipulation. It is deep understanding of human behavior. In practice, anyone can begin training their mind to develop this ability. A simple exercise works very well. During a conversation, try speaking 30% less and observing 70% more. Pay attention to three things: tone of voice, body language, and the timing of responses. You will quickly notice that people reveal far more than they imagine. This simple habit develops something extremely valuable: the ability to think ahead in social interactions. And when someone begins to master this strategic observation, a competitive advantage naturally appears. Because while many people are reacting to the moment, some are already seeing the next move. And this is exactly where an even more powerful skill begins to appear. Something that transforms observation into true mental strategy. There is a silent difference between people who simply react to life and those who always seem a few steps ahead. That difference has a simple name: second-order thinking. Imagine a common situation. Someone criticizes your idea in a meeting. The most common reaction is immediate. Defend yourself, explain, prove that you are right. That is first-order thinking, reacting to what just happened. But what few people realize is that strategists rarely play that game. Before responding, they ask a silent question in their own mind. If I react now, what happens next? This small mental pause changes everything. Suddenly, the conversation stops being just an exchange of arguments and becomes a game of psychological control. One simple way to understand this is by imagining a chessboard. A beginner thinks only about the current move. A strategist thinks about the next three. In social life, the exact same thing happens. When someone provokes you, most people react. But those who develop intellectual curiosity start to observe the situation differently. Why did that person make that comment? What reaction are they trying to provoke? And most importantly, which response would completely break that pattern? This is where a strategy used by great strategists throughout history comes into play. Instead of responding in the expected way, they change the dynamics of the game. Sometimes with silence, sometimes with a question, sometimes simply by shifting the focus of the conversation. In practice, developing this type of thinking requires training. A good way to train your mind is to run a small mental exercise during important conversations. Whenever someone says something that triggers an immediate reaction, mentally ask yourself, what will be the effect of my response 5 minutes from now? This simple habit begins to create something extremely powerful, the ability to think ahead in interactions. And when this ability develops, a huge competitive advantage naturally appears in social and professional environments. Because while many people are trying to win the argument of the moment, some are already shaping the outcome of the entire conversation. And when someone masters this art, another even more important skill begins to appear, something that determines who maintains control even under pressure. In almost every meeting, debate, or difficult conversation, there is a moment that works like a small invisible test. Someone makes a provocative comment. Maybe a subtle criticism. Maybe a light irony. It is at that moment that many people reveal more than they imagine. Some respond immediately, rushing to defend themselves. Others raise their voice, trying to regain authority. But what few people realize is that these quick reactions often deliver exactly what the other side was looking for, an emotional response. And when someone reacts this way, the balance of the conversation shifts. The one who provokes begins to control the dynamic. On the other hand, when someone remains calm, something curious happens. A silent form of social power begins to emerge, almost as if the person were taking psychological control of the situation without raising their voice. A good analogy to understand this is to think about a captain steering a ship during a storm. Imagine two different captains. One panics when the waves grow stronger. The other remains calm, observes the wind, adjusts the rudder, and guides the ship precisely. Which one inspires more confidence in the crew? In human interactions, the exact same thing happens. When someone remains emotionally stable while others become agitated, it sparks intellectual curiosity in the people around them. They begin to notice something different about that posture. There is a historical reason for this. Maintaining emotional stability has always been a strategy used by great strategists, military leaders, and experienced negotiators. In practice, developing this ability begins with a small daily training. Whenever someone makes a comment that would normally provoke an immediate reaction, try pausing for 3 seconds before answering. It sounds simple, but that small pause completely changes the mental dynamic. During that interval, the mind gains space to think ahead instead of merely reacting. Over time, this habit strengthens something essential: the ability to train your mind to maintain clarity even in moments of pressure. And when this emotional stability begins to appear consistently, a huge competitive advantage emerges in social and professional relationships. Because while some people lose energy reacting, others are quietly steering the direction of the conversation, and this is exactly where another interesting ability appears. A simple tool that can completely change the direction of any dialogue. There is a curious moment in many important conversations. Someone presents a long argument full of justifications, trying to convince everyone around them. Normally, people respond with another equally long argument. It becomes almost like a duel of words. But what few people realize is that the most skilled strategists rarely enter this type of direct dispute. Instead, they do something much simpler and much more powerful. They ask a question, a short, precise question, almost too calm for the tension of the moment. and suddenly the entire dynamic of the conversation changes. The person who was dominating the speech now has to explain, justify, clarify. Without realizing it, they moved from the attacking position to the defensive one. This small shift creates subtle psychological control over the conversation. An old negotiation consultant used to explain this with an interesting metaphor. He said arguments are like pushing a heavy door. Questions, on the other hand, are like turning the doorknob. With far less effort, the door opens. This happens because good questions spark intellectual curiosity in the people around. They begin reflecting on the issue presented. At the same time, the person receiving the question must reorganize their thinking. This is a classic principle, a strategy used by great strategists in debates, negotiations, and even diplomacy. Instead of attacking directly, they shift the field of conversation with an intelligent question. In practice, anyone can train their mind to use this ability. Try testing some simple questions in important conversations. For example, what exactly makes you think that? Or, what would be the consequence of that decision 6 months from now? Questions like these encourage people to think more deeply. And while most people try to win discussions by speaking louder or faster, those who learn to ask the right questions begin to think ahead in the conversation. Over time, this creates a powerful competitive advantage in professional and social environments, because the conversation stops being just an exchange of opinions and becomes a strategic construction of understanding. And when someone begins to observe how people respond to these questions, something even more fascinating starts to appear: invisible patterns in human behavior. In real life, anyone can begin developing this ability with a simple exercise. In meetings, conversations, or even informal gatherings, observe two things: what people say and what they repeatedly do. Who always avoids responsibility? Who constantly seeks approval? Who changes behavior depending on who is in the room? These small repetitions reveal far more than long speeches. Over time, this practice begins to create a powerful competitive advantage. Because while most people react to situations at the moment they happen, those who learn to observe patterns begin to think ahead in social interactions. And this ability does not appear by chance. It emerges when someone deliberately decides to train their mind to understand people more deeply. When this perception begins to mature, something interesting happens. Conversations stop feeling unpredictable. Other people's decisions stop feeling surprising. Little by little, social dynamics start to become clearer, almost as if an invisible map were being revealed. That is exactly why this perception has always been considered a strategy used by great strategists throughout history. They did not rely only on logical intelligence. They studied human behavior. And when someone combines this observation with intellectual curiosity, something extremely powerful appears: the ability to anticipate social moves before they happen. And when someone begins to perceive these patterns clearly, an interesting sensation emerges. As if the social world stopped being unpredictable chaos and started to follow a logic. People's reactions begin to make sense. Tensions become more predictable. And gradually, this understanding generates something even more valuable: strategic confidence. A silent form of psychological control that does not depend on manipulating anyone, but on deeply understanding how people work. And when this perception finally solidifies, an inevitable question arises in the mind of the person learning all this. If all these abilities can be developed, what happens when someone begins to apply this knowledge consciously in their own life? Now it is worth pausing for a moment and thinking about something simple. How many decisions in your life were made on impulse? How many important conversations have you had where you realized too late what was really happening? The truth is that most people spend years reacting to situations without ever stopping to understand the invisible dynamics that move human behavior. But now, you have already noticed something different. You have started to see what few people realize, that developing intellectual curiosity about people and the situations around you can completely change the way you live, decide, and position yourself in the world. Think about this for a moment. If you learn to observe before reacting, ask questions before arguing, and think ahead in social situations, the way you move through the world changes. Conversations stop being confrontations and become strategic reading. Decisions stop being impulsive and become conscious. This creates something extremely powerful, a silent form of psychological control over your own posture. And this ability does not belong to a select group of people. It can be developed when someone decides to train their mind daily, observing behaviors, reflecting on patterns, and learning from every interaction. Now the important question is, will you apply this, or will you continue reacting to the world the way most people do? Because developing this mindset has always been a strategy used by great strategists. People who understood that the greatest competitive advantage is not in speaking louder or acting faster, but in understanding the game being played. So tell me in the comments, which of these ideas are you going to start applying in your life first? And if you want to continue developing this strategic mindset and discover what few people realize about human behavior, social power, and emotional intelligence, then take a moment to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications. Because the mission here is simple: help you train your mind to see the world with much more clarity. Now, here is a small reflection. How many times has someone walked away from a conversation thinking, "I should have responded differently"? This happens because many people are still reacting on autopilot. They enter discussions trying to defend ideas, prove points, win debates. But after everything explored here, something begins to become clear. The most strategic people rarely enter that game in the same way. They observe, analyze, ask questions, and learn to think ahead in situations. And what few people realize is that this type of intelligence does not depend on special talent. It emerges when someone decides to develop intellectual curiosity about how human interactions really work. If you began noticing these dynamics while watching, you have already taken the first step. Because all of this ability begins with a simple decision: training your mind to observe conversations, behaviors, and motivations more deeply. Over time, this creates something extremely valuable: a silent form of psychological control over your own posture in social situations. And when this perception develops, a huge competitive advantage naturally appears in meetings, negotiations, important decisions, and even personal relationships. Not because someone tries to dominate others, but because they begin to understand the social game better than most people. And here is a simple invitation. If you want to continue developing this strategic perception, understanding human behavior, decisions, and social dynamics better, it is worth continuing to explore this kind of knowledge. So consider subscribing to the channel and activating notifications, because the idea here is precisely to share ideas that spark intellectual curiosity and reveal what few people realize about mental strategy and human behavior. After all, developing this kind of vision has always been a strategy used by great strategists throughout history. And the more you learn to observe, reflect, and train your mind, the more prepared you become to think ahead in the situations that life places in your path.